In today's video, we'll discuss an Air France flight incident where a misread chart endangered the crew near Mount Cameroon. When the alarms went off, training and fast thinking emerged. Let's look at what happened and what the most important takeaways are. Air France Flight 953 is scheduled to depart from Paris Charles de Gaulle in France on May 1, 2015, and arrive in Malabo, Equatorial Guinea. The Boeing 777 experienced a few technical problems earlier in the day, which caused the original departure time to be delayed. As a result, Air France has been forced to add a third flight crew member to the crew to extend the crew's duty hours. Now that they are flying together, the pilots have much experience. 6,000 of the captain's 15,000 plus hours are spent on type. The relief pilot called out had about 15,000 hours total, while the first officer had just over 5,000 hours. The crew had 2 more short hops planned, from Malabo to Douala in Cameroon, and back to Malabo after operating the first flight from Paris to Malabo, so this would be a very long day for them. Additionally, they had a night stop scheduled for when they returned to Malabo. They had to operate from Malabo, return to Douala, and then, from Douala, return to the home base in Paris the next day. After operating these 2 brief flights, they quickly concluded that the most effective way to do the cockpit work was to conduct the arrival and approach briefings, as well as the departure briefing simultaneously, while still seated on the ground, since once they were in the air, those 20 minutes would fly by very swiftly. Furthermore, the region between Douala and Malabo was off the radar. This required a great deal of focus from both the pilot in the air and the pilot in observation, who had to communicate with air traffic control frequently, and in doing so, they managed to run these 2 flights, and the day's weather was excellent. Thus, there were no issues at all with the last 2 flights. The weather had taken a turn for the worse by the second day. There were now numerous active thunderstorms over the destination airport, Douala, and Malabo. The pilots tried to understand the weather but needed help finding reliable weather data. Additionally, the captain used a lot of pre-flight time to get the weather picture read out by using a satellite phone to reach the headquarters in Paris. This led to a tremendous deal of confusion and frustration. Upon commencing their daily briefing, the crew stated that the primary danger they faced was the unfavorable weather conditions at both the departure and destination airports, and while traveling between them. After receiving the weather report and wrapping up their briefing, the flight crew briefed the 11 cabin crew members about the day's flight. Afterwards, they went outside to the aircraft. They began the process of boarding with only 23 passengers for the flight to Douala. The first officer started preparing the flight deck for takeoff, after it was decided that he would be the pilot for this inaugural flight. After completing that, he began organizing the briefing for the takeoff from Malabo and the landing on the then operational Douala runway 30. He briefed that the weather would be the main threat to this departure, but he also mentioned that there was a significant amount of terrain south of Malabo Airport, which meant they would need to make a right turn after takeoff, rather than the left turn that their flight plan called for. After reconnecting with the flight plan, he said they would head toward the DME arc for runway 30. A procedural arrival known as a DME arc is based on an aircraft flying a predetermined distance from the airport until it encounters an inbound radio signal from a VOR beacon. At this time, it turns into intercepting the ILS approach. The first officer utilized a standard arrival IFR route chart to complete the briefing. This was because Malabo and Douala were both included on the same chart, which made it much simpler to brief. However, the first officer neglected to mention or failed to mention that Malabo was inserted as an insert on that particular chart. In other words, the chart in the south needed to be more accurate. It displayed the correct bearing from the Malabo airport to Douala, but needed the proper distance, and that will soon come to be significant. In his brief, the first officer also noted that Mount Cameroon, an ancient volcano, was situated in some higher terrain north of the chart. There, the grid mora was 15,300 feet. This indicates that in that specific chart grid, that is the altitude at which an aircraft must fly to have a minimum of 1,000 feet of terrain separation. That was not a serious threat, though, as the flight plan route was supposed to pass well south of Mount Cameroon. The first officer would use weather radar on his navigation display, the crew decided after further discussion about the flight. In this manner, he could keep track of the locations of all the active thunderstorms. The captain would continuously monitor the terrain on his navigation display to determine whether they were approaching land. This would allow them to maximize their navigational aids and locate all potential threats. Observing that this would be a busy and intricate flight, the captain also instructed the relief pilot seated on the jump seat to keep his eyes and ears open and raise his voice if he noticed anything that didn't seem quite right. As I previously stated, few passengers were scheduled for this inaugural flight. Thus, for this brief flight, a cabin crew member was also permitted to enter and take a seat on the jump seat. This cabin crew member could not hear the departure briefing because he was not given a headset. Still, he was there, watching. The captain wasn't entirely prepared when the time for departure finally arrived. Because he was still unsure of the weather, so he postponed the flight. Although he knew that the weather in Malabo, where they were, was improving, and the thunderstorms were dispersing, he was unaware of the conditions in Douala, their intended destination. So he picked up the satellite phone again and called Air France's headquarters in Paris. At 20:45, he received the most recent weather report, which stated that the thunderstorms in Douala were slowly moving eastward and that 2 planes had safely landed there. The captain had been waiting exactly for this kind of news. Thus, Air France Flight 953 began pushing back from the gate and taxiing out for takeoff at 20:53. When the first officer pulled forward his thrust levers to initiate takeoff thrust, the enormous Boeing 777 began to roll down the runway at precisely 21:03. After taking off as planned, the first officer began to turn right on a 030 degree, heading to avoid the terrain to the airport's south. The first officer's navigation display showed several large red thunderstorms almost immediately. With the terrain selected on his navigation display, the captain believed they were out of the dangerous terrain. He changed the weather display on his navigation to further assist him in assessing the situation. There were a lot of thunderstorms along the original route they intended to take to return. They consequently realized that they couldn't turn around on that. Rather, they started selecting a more northerly course and kept flying and heading select. They had to let the Douala approach controller know this as they were doing it. Additionally, as I previously stated, there is no radar available, so it took several minutes for the captain, who was pilot monitoring, and the radar controller to have this conversation. In contrast, the captain updated the controller on their actions. The first officer examined his navigation display, attempting to make sense of what he saw while the captain was preoccupied with this conversation. In front of him, he could make out a sizable red return, but to his right was an odd oval-shaped return that appeared to be following the plane as it headed north. He momentarily turned from weather to terrain, trying to figure out what that strange return was. In addition, he raised the scale from 40 to 80 nautical miles. After waiting for roughly 6 seconds, he could not see anything on his navigation display. He turned back to weather radar. After this assessment persuaded him that he was witnessing a large red return in the front, which was unmistakably approaching Mount Cameroon and matched the information he had received from the chart. He also considered the possibility that the odd red return he was experiencing on the right side was fake. It's crucial to realize that you must give the screen time to update when you change the mode on your navigation display, such as from weather radar to terrain. Additionally, it usually takes 8 seconds to complete the update. Additionally, this update must be performed whenever you change the scale or mode. Since the first officer had only switched over for 6 seconds and changed the map's scale, the screen probably didn't refresh during the terrain period. Let's now briefly discuss the Boeing 777's terrain display. The Global Terrain Database provides the display data. Once it has determined its location, it will display the terrain to the pilots on the display in the scale that they have chosen. It displays the terrain by dotting every piece of ground between 2,000 and 500 feet lower than the aircraft's current altitude in green. The terrain is represented by amber dots between 500 feet below and 2,000 feet above sea level. Little red dots are also painted on terrain higher than 2,000 feet above the aircraft's current altitude. If a terrain warning were issued, those dots would become solid, either solid green, solid amber, or solid red. Moreover, regardless of the previous selection, it would turn on terrain on both navigation displays. Before continuing, I'd like to share my sponsor's brief message. This will become very important soon. Did you know that besides being a professional pilot and YouTuber, I read 2 or 3 books on some days? Okay, listen to me for a moment. Today's sponsor, Blinkist, results from this time management miracle. Blinkist is a wonderful app that reduces non-fiction books and titles to their most basic form, or what they refer to as blinks. This means it can take you as little as 15 to 20 minutes to read a book or listen to a podcast, which they now refer to as shortcasts, which is ideal. I usually use Blinkist when I go to the gym, when I'm exercising outside, which I love to do in the morning, or when I'm doing other things. The app allows you to narrow down to niche categories that you may find interesting. The Flight, Atomic Habits, and Off the Clock were the 3 books I recently read. If you click on the link in the video description below, or the comments section, you can try Blinkist for free for 7 days and receive 25% off the regular price. I highly recommend it to anyone with a busy schedule who still wants to read many excellent books. Thus, please think about helping me by helping my sponsor. Let's return to the video now. The first officer is asked to make a right turn to begin connecting with the DME arc for the arrival towards Douala by the captain approximately 10 minutes into the flight. The first officer is reluctant to make this right-hand turn, and the captain is still in constant communication with ATC. On his navigation display, that weird red oval return is still visible. However, he is also aware that there is a much bigger red return directly ahead of him, which he believes to be Mount Cameroon, and he most certainly wants to avoid flying into that one. The first officer begins his turn slowly to the right and sets the heading bug to a heading off 120 degrees. But the relief pilot also seems hesitant. The aircraft starts the turn by banking about 25 degrees to the right. Approximately 30 seconds into the turn, at time 21:14:12 seconds. First, a word of caution. Ground. In the cockpit, there is an audible GPWS warning. The first officer reacts to this warning by turning the heading bug even further to the right, onto a heading of 134 degrees, as the maritime displays automatically switch to the terrain. The aircraft is currently at its intended cruising altitude of 9,000 feet, but is only 5,000 feet above the ground and is falling quickly. After just 3 seconds, the following. Terrain, GPWS, get in line. A GPWS warning sounds, alerting the pilot that a possible collision with terrain is approximately 30 seconds away. Terrain, terrain. Upon hearing that warning, pilots are trained to perform a single, unquestioning action. They must immediately begin the terrain escape maneuver, precisely what the first officer does. He pitches up to what he thinks is a pitch up of roughly 20 degrees, increases thrust to its maximum, and confirms that the speed brake is engaged. And he keeps flying the plane after that. Please note that they were in a turn when this warning appeared, and still are. The relief pilot calls out to the pilot in the lead, instructing him to level the wings off, and the first officer complies. As a result, he will be able to climb more effectively and have a better chance of avoiding the terrain. The first officer performing the terrain escape maneuver has now heard the captain call, "Pull up! Pull up!" And both he and the cabin crew member seated on the jump seat can see the outlines of dark trees outside the windows as they climb as high as they can. In actuality, what has transpired here? What is happening? Remember how the first officer briefed the departures and arrivals in Douala using that typical arrival IFR chart? The departure airport was shown as an inset in that chart, which was problematic. And if you don't think about it, that chart gives the false impression that Mount Cameroon is located nearly exactly north of the airport of departure. This indicated that the crew mistook Mount Cameroon for a much closer target because they were heading northeastern instead of following their pre-flight plan, leading them to believe the mountain was to their east. They were approaching the hill from the west, and the 13,202-foot peak stood between them and the arrival airport. The captain recalls that a few months before this, during a simulator session, the first officer continued to fly the terrain escape maneuver, while the GPWS warnings were continuously screaming in the cockpit. He had also performed a terrain escape maneuver during that simulator session, but crashed into higher altitude traffic. As he considers that, he becomes aware that he has no idea if there is any traffic overhead when they are performing the terrain escape maneuver. Upon reaching an altitude of approximately 11,000 feet, the captain requests that the first officer begin leveling the aircraft. The captain keeps saying that he wants the first officer to level off, but at first, he ignores this and keeps climbing through 12,000 feet. The first officer obeys this order, leveling the aircraft off at 13,000 feet. But did I mention that the safety height in that chart area, the grid mora, was roughly 15,300 feet? This indicates that the aircraft has descended more than 2,000 feet below the safety altitude in that sector. Fortunately, however, it turns out that they passed northeast of Mount Cameroon's highest peak, meaning that the aircraft's lowest height over terrain was roughly 2,100 feet as they passed through an 11,500-foot ascent. At last, the ordeal was over, and the crew resumed their navigation towards the DME arc arrival for runway 30 in Douala, with the first officer re-engaging the autopilot and auto-throttle. In a soothing, collected tone, the captain questioned the first officer about whether it was safe for him to take off again. After they taxied in and finished the shutdown checklist, the first officer reported that he began to shake all over, which I can understand completely. This seemed to calm him down slightly, and he said, "Yeah, I can continue to do the approach." The subsequent approach and landing in Douala went smoothly. After conducting a debriefing among themselves, the crew got in touch with Air France operation. Furthermore, this is crucial. As a pilot, you must take this action following a serious incident or accident to receive guidance on what to do next. Generally speaking, the crew should pull the CVR circuit breaker to save the cockpit voice recorder data for the next investigation, especially after a close encounter with terrain like this. Interestingly, though, Air France this time asked the crew if they were pleased to carry on with operations. Surprisingly, the crew accepted this and flew the day's final flight back up to Charles de Gaulle. All of the crew members involved in the investigation into this very serious incident said their simulator training on terrain escape maneuvers was very effective, and they had to complete it recently for the potentially disastrous event to have a positive outcome. During the investigation, it was also discovered that Air France needed to properly assess the threat level of this chart route, taking into account factors such as the short flight duration, the absence of radar, and the threats posed by Mount Cameroon and its high terrain. The crew's use of an IFR arrival chart as their main navigational aid during this was deemed imprudent by the investigation, as it caused them to lose situational awareness. However, they also recommended that Boeing consider adding grid moras to the navigation display, as this may help crews regain situational awareness if they unintentionally venture into a high-terrain area. Thanks for watching. If you found this story interesting, don't forget to like and subscribe for more gripping tales from history. See you in the next video.